Hello and welcome to the video presentation for module number 16. This module we're going to be talking about the 5/7 chord and how it resolves, how it's spelled, and how it functions. So first we'll work on how to prepare and resolve the 5/7 in the correct way. And then we'll work on how to recognize and write the 5/7 chord in figured bass. So the 5/7 chord. So 5/7 chord is a dominant 7th chord built on the 5th degree of a major or a minor scale. So they can exist in either a major scale or a minor scale. So here are all the chords, all the triads that are possible in the key of D major. And remember doing this, we were using the Roman numerals to name each one. And for the 5th one, the A chord, I'm going to add a G to it to make it into a 5/7 chord. So it's a 5 chord A, but it's in the key of D major, and we're adding a G to it to make it a 5/7 chord, which is called the dominant 7th chord, and this is the one in the key of D major. Now, it can also exist in a minor key, but you have to remember that it's always a major minor 7th chord, also known as a dominant 7th chord, which means it will always have a major triad on the bottom and a minor 7th on top. So here are all the chords in a D minor scale. And again, we've put a Roman numeral for each of them. And you can see when I have that 5, I'm still going to add that G to it, and it's still an A major chord, and it will still have that same G on it. So it's identical to what it is in the key of D major. So that's a really important thing to remember is the 5/7 will always be a major minor 7th chord, which means it will always have a major triad and a minor 7th. And that is true in a major key and in a minor key. So let's talk about how this thing actually works. So a 5/7 has an incredibly strong pull to either the 1 chord in major or the 1 chord in minor. If I play it, you can kind of hear where it wants to go. So here's 5/7 in this key of D. And you can hear it wants to go to here. Right? It wants to resolve there. So let's talk about why it has such a strong pull in that direction. It has to do with the notes that are in the chord. So the 5/7 chord has 2 special notes in it. One is the leading tone of the key, right? So if you looked at this chord, you'd see that the leading tone of the key of D major is somewhere in here. So this is, like I said, the key of D major. So the leading tone of D major is C sharp because that's the note that wants to move most strongly to D, right? So the leading tone is here as its 3rd. And it also has the 4th degree of the scale, Fa, right here. So let's talk about that. And so, as you remember, the T, at least, the leading tone, right, is what we call a tendency tone. That means it sounds like it needs to move strongly to the tonic. So if I played that C sharp, and this is the key of D, so we know that that C sharp wants to go to there, right? It has that tendency to move that direction. Okay, so that's one of the notes in the chord, is the leading tone T, but it has another tendency tone as well, which is the 4th degree of the scale. And the 4th degree of the scale, also called Fa, wants to go down to Mi. So we have a note in the chord that wants to go up to Do, and another note that wants to go down to Mi. So 2 tendency tones in one chord. So T wants to go to Do, Fa wants to go to Mi. And when they both get there, they end up on Do and Mi, which are the root and 3rd of the tonic chord, right? Because that's a D and an F sharp. So that's why this chord wants to go so strongly to the 1 chord, because it has notes that both have a tendency to go to the 3rd of the scale and the tonic of the scale, which gives us D and F sharp in this case, which is almost all the notes we need to spell a 1 chord, right? We could also put an A on top. We end up with our full chord, right? So that's one of the reasons. And another reason is more harmonic than melodic, but it's kind of related. And that is The leading tone, that T, and that fourth degree of the scale, Fa, also create a really special interval when they sound together. So if I play C sharp and G at the same time, right, it creates this really dissonant interval. And that's called the tritone, which could be an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth. Okay? The tritone is very dissonant, and it sounds like it needs to resolve to a consonance. And the consonance it needs to resolve to is either going to be a third, or it can also go the other direction to a sixth, right? So that tritone, because of those tendency tones and the interval that it creates, the 5/7 sounds like it needs to resolve to the 1, right? And so you can see that tritone in this chord. We have a C sharp here as its third, and this is a G natural. So that's a fifth, but it's not a perfect fifth, right? C sharp to G is a diminished fifth, which is our tritone. Okay, we'll write a little triangle for that. And that tritone, because that C sharp wants to resolve up to a D, and that G wants to resolve down to an F sharp, that tritone resolves to a third. Okay. All right. Now, because of this, the 5/7 must be created and resolved in the correct way because it has such a special function. So let's talk about how we do that, how we use the chord. So we call this resolving the 5/7, and we just mean how do we make this chord feel like it really goes to the 1 chord, right? How do we treat the notes so that they resolve, that they move to the correct notes that they need to make it sound like it's resolving to the next chord. So the number 1 rule is the 7th of the 5/7 always resolves down by a step. So that Fa will always go to a Mi. So here's our chord now in 4 voices instead of that stack of thirds like we just looked at. But this is the same chord. It's still an A7 chord in the key of D major. And so rule number 1 is the 7th always resolves down by a step. So the thing to do is find the 7th in this chord and just make sure that that voice moves down by a step. So this is the key of D. This is an A7 chord. So the note that is a 7th above the bass in this case would be the note G, right? Because A to G is a 7th. So that's the note that we want to have resolve down by a step. Okay, and so that means that that G, to resolve correctly into the 1 chord, needs to resolve down by a step to the F sharp. Okay, so check, we did our first step. And then the second rule is that the third of the chord, so whatever a third above the root is, because that's the leading tone, it should resolve up to by a step to the tonic, okay? Especially if it's in either the soprano or the bass part, so the outer voices we call those. So if we found that note in this chord, so this was our A major chord, the third of this chord is a C sharp, and we see that that C sharp is in the soprano. So since that's in a soprano part, the outer voice, it definitely needs to move up, and T moves up by a step to become Do. So we've moved both of the notes that we need to move, and we move them in the direction that they should move to. Okay. Now the rest of the notes just kind of follow good voice leading, right? So we need this to be a root position 1. So the root of the 1 chord in the key of D major is going to be another D. So we'll put that here. And then this note, since we already have a third, we don't really need it to move to an F sharp. We could just have it go down by a step to become a D. Okay, so this is the best way to resolve the 5/7 chord to a 1 chord. Okay, there you go. And all we did was follow the rule that 7th needs to go down. So the G went down to an F sharp. And the leading tone, the third, needs to go up. The C sharp went up to the D. Okay. So a little bit more details. Whenever you're resolving a 5/7 to 1, and they're both in root position, it's very difficult to make the chords both complete. And that means that they often will not have all the notes of the chord. and the note that will be left out is usually the fifth. So let's see what happens with this example if I try to make this complete. Now this is the key of C minor, so a different key. And in C minor, we're trying to have a 5-7 in root position go to a 1, also in root position. So let's follow our rule. So our 7th needs to go down by a step. And in the key of C minor, this is going to be a G7 chord. So the 7th of G7 is F. So if we find an F in this chord, that'll be our 7th. And that is here in the alto. So that alto needs to move down by a step. Now notice it doesn't matter if it's a half step or a whole step, you just follow the key. So in this case, the F goes down to an E flat, which is according to the key. All right, now a leading tone, the 3rd, is the next thing we need to worry about, and that needs to resolve up by a step, especially if it's in the soprano or bass. And that is in fact in the soprano. That's the B natural, that's the leading tone of C. So that will go up by a step to C. So we have that part of the chord done. Okay. Now we can move the bass note down to a C as well, and that's fine. Now let's see what happens when we try to make this chord complete, because the other note that we need to have in this chord is the 5th. So we have a C, an E flat, another C. To make this complete, we would need a G, and the only way we can get that is if we have our tenor leap down to that G by 5th, and we end up with parallel fifths, which is not something that we need. Okay, so you'll see that whenever you try to do these both in root position, you'll often end up with that problem where you'll have a voice that needs to move or leap, and that will often create parallel fifths with other voices. So we can't do that, which is one of the things that makes it difficult to make both of these chords complete. So what normally happens when you have when I have a 5-7 and a 1 root position is that one chord will be incomplete and the other chord will be complete. Okay, so one chord will be complete, it will have all of its notes, but the other one will have to be incomplete. It will have to be missing its 5th. So here's how we could have solved that previous example with all the chords, all the notes being complete, right? So in this first one, the 5-7 in root position, we have our G, our D, our F natural, and our B. So that is a complete 5-7 chord. And then in the next chord, we'll see that we are, let's see, we have a C, an E flat, another E flat, so the 3rd is doubled, and another C. So that is missing its 5th, so that is incomplete. So we've solved this problem to avoid parallel fifths by having the first chord, the 5-7, be complete, and the second chord, the 1, be incomplete. Okay. So here's another solution, and for this one, our 1 chord is complete because it has its C, G, E flat, and C, but our 5 chord is missing its 5th because it only has G, F, and B natural, and that's fine. It can be incomplete. It can be missing its 5th and still sound okay. So in this case, we did incomplete first and ended up on a complete chord. So that's really the best way to make sure that you avoid any kind of voice leading problems, to have one chord be complete and the other chord be incomplete. And it's not wrong, it's just the right way to do it. Okay. All right, so another detail about this is that we have to worry about the leading tone sometimes. So another way to avoid this parallel fifth stuff is that we can make the leading tone not resolve up by a step to the tonic. Okay, so that can only happen when the leading tone is not in an outer voice. So that can only happen when the leading tone is not in the soprano or not in the bass, as it is here. So here we have our 5-7 chord again in the key of C minor, going to a 1 chord. And if we follow all the rules, so our 7th needs to resolve down, so that's that F, needs to resolve down by a step. And this time we're going to ignore the rule of the leading tone needing to resolve up, and we're just going to kind of do whatever we think is best. So let's go to our bass. Our bass can go down to a C, and our top note D can also go down to a C. And then to get that G, if we have that B natural, instead of going up to a C, we could have the B natural go down to a G, which doesn't follow the rule that we just said. So the leading tone doesn't resolve, but that's okay because it's in the inner voice, it's in a tenor voice, right? Something you're not going to hear as easily, so we can get away with it not resolving. All right, so you don't really hear it stick out as much. So that's also a way that you can have both chords be complete. Okay. All right, so we also need to worry about how we create the seventh. So how we get to the note that is the seventh of the chord. And the seventh should always be created correctly by properly approaching the note in the chord that comes before the 5/7 chord. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and they are similar to how we were using non-chord tones, except these are not actually non-chord tones because it's the seventh that we're creating that we're going to identify as looking like one is not actually a non-chord tone. It actually does belong in the 5/7. So these are all similar progressions in the key of F. And for each of these, we've created the seventh in a different way. So in this first example, the seventh of the 5/7 is going to be created as what's called a suspension. Okay, and so that B flat, which is the seventh of our C7 chord, which is the 5/7 in the key of F, that B flat is created by just repeating a note from the chord before. So that B flat gets repeated as the B flat, that's the seventh in the next chord, and then it resolves down by a step. So since that looks like the non-chord tone where we repeat something and then resolve that down by a step, we say that that seventh is created by something that looks like a suspension. Okay. Now for each of these, we're just going to be looking at how we create that B flat basically. In this next one, it's created as a passing tone. Okay, so in this example, the B flat that should be the seventh of this chord is created as a passing tone, and that's because it's in this alto here, right? So we start on one note, we go to a new note, so we go down by step to a new note, and then we keep going in the same direction to another new note. So since that kind of looks like a passing tone, even though none of those are non-chord tones, we call that a passing tone creation of the seventh. Okay. Let's look at another one, and this one is created as something that looks like a neighbor tone. So the seventh in this chord again is B flat, and that this time is in the tenor. And you can see that in the tenor, we start on the A, we go up by a step to a B flat, and then we step back down to that same A. So that kind of looks like a neighbor tone where we start one place, go up to another place, and return home. So we call that a neighbor tone. We would describe this as creating a seventh by way of neighbor tone. Okay, and then the final one is an appoggiatura. So remember, appoggiatura is a leap and then a step. So the B flat, that is the seventh of the 5/7, is created by a leap up and then a step down. Okay, and so that B flat is leapt to from the G, so we're leaping from the G to the B flat, and then resolving it by stepping down. And whenever we leap and then step down, we call that an appoggiatura. So that's called creating a seventh by way of appoggiatura. So the whole point of this is that whenever we have these in real music, they are not really just they don't really just pop up, right? They're almost always created from the chord that came before, right? Either by repeating it as a suspension, by moving to it on its way to another new note as a passing tone, or stepping up and then stepping back down as a neighbor tone, or by a small leap and then a step down, which is called an appoggiatura. Okay. All right, so one last thing to talk about, which is what the 5/7 looks like in a figured bass example. So in a figured bass, the number 7 tells you that the chord is a root position 7th chord. Okay, so it's up to you to find this chord in the figured bass and then do all the stuff we just talked about to it. So prepare the 7th correctly and then resolve the chord properly, which means to create that 7th through one of the patterns we just talked about. And then once you get that 7th needs to resolve down by a step. And then if the leading tone, the third of the chord, is in an outer voice, that needs to resolve up by step. So here's an example. And you'll see we have no numbers under the first one, which means this is a root position chord. A 6, that's a first inversion. 6, another first inversion. And then here we have a 7 with a sharp, which means that we're going to have a 7th above this E, and also the third, right? Because sharp by itself means sharp 3. The third will be raised, okay? And then we have a root position chord. So this chord here, the fourth one in the first measure, is going to be our 7 chord, all right? And so I know here that I'm in the key of A minor, and this is a 7th chord built on E, which is the 5th degree of the scale, and it's a major triad, so it'll be an E, a G sharp, and a B, and then it'll have a D on it too, so that'll be a 5/7 in the key of A minor. That is our leading tone, or I'm sorry, our dominant 7th chord, okay, which resolves to a 1 chord over that A there. All right, so the easiest thing to do, I think, for these might be to find that special chord, because it will usually be at the end, and then just finish that first. So get the hard stuff out of the way. Now, I'm going to write my G sharp in my soprano, so I know that there's no question about how it needs to resolve. Okay, and then I know that that G sharp has to resolve up by a step, because that's the leading tone. And leading tones, like I said, always resolve up by a step to the tonic. So that G sharp will definitely need to go to an A. And so you can see that that created nice contrary motion. And we end on the octave above that note. Okay. Now from here, you could write the rest of the soprano. And I might be able to just kind of work my way backwards. So if I have contrary motion, I would want to go to an A by step, right? But you can't have an A in this chord because it's a first inversion chord. So I actually have to go to the note B. Okay. And then I could skip to the beginning now. So maybe I'll start on a note kind of close to that, maybe on the C. And now I want to have contrary motion, so maybe I'll have C go down to the note A, because I can have an A in this first inversion triad. And now I have a soprano line that mostly has contrary motion and a nice shape leading to the A. Okay, now from here I just fill in my inner voices. And again, you might want to just kind of skip over to that 5/7 chord and make sure that that has everything it needs to have in it. So the note D is going to be the 7th, so I need to find a place for that, and maybe I'll put that in my alto, because I think if I put it in my tenor, I won't have room for my alto to do much else, but we'll see. Okay, and then you could decide if you want this chord to be complete or incomplete, and I'm gonna make this chord complete, so I'm gonna give it the note B here. All right, now I've already resolved my leading tone up by a step. My 7th needs to resolve down by a step, so that D that I just wrote is the 7th. So that needs to resolve down by a step to become the C. And now this chord over here, this one chord, since my 5/7 is complete, it needs to be incomplete. So I need to leave out one of the notes of the chord. And that note is always going to be the 5th. So I will have my B and my tenor resolve down to an A to have an incomplete final triad. Which sounds fine. Okay. Now from here you could complete the rest of the voice leading, and And the important thing to remember is that we need to create the seventh in some way. And so you could ask yourself, well, how could I get to that? Can I get there through a passing tone? So can I have an E here in my tenor? Well, you can't, because that note does not belong in that chord, right? Well, can I create it through a neighbor tone? So can I have the note C? Well, you can't, because that C does not belong in that chord, so you can't use that neighbor tone technique. Okay. What about a suspension? All right, so can I write the note D here? And yep, you can. So this way I'm creating this seventh chord as a suspension, because I'm repeating the D from the previous chord to become the seventh in the next chord. Okay. And then from there, you just follow the rules of voice leading, which will finish this out. So I am actually not going to spend time doing that because I think you guys have that skill. So we will not worry about that. But this is what you want to do: is write your soprano, write your seventh chord, and then, excuse me, then focus on the stuff that needs to resolve in that chord, such as the leading tone. And the seventh, make sure the seventh is created correctly, and make sure the seventh resolves correctly. Make sure that one is complete, one chord is complete, and the other chord is incomplete. Okay. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be doing more of this in class and in the homework, and have a great day.